welcome to the Midland Public Library's virtual author visit with Barrie Doyle. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Jennifer Paquette, and I am the Adult and Teen Services Coordinator at MPL, and I am your host for this evening. Before we get into the meat of the program, just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. So all participants have been muted, and your cameras are turned off. If you're having technical difficulties, please use the chat box, and I will try my best to assist you. We will be recording this session for archiving on our website, as well as available on our social media channels. Midland Public Library acknowledges and is thankful for the opportunity to work on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, which includes the Chippewa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa people. We especially acknowledge the Chippewa of Rosalie First Nation and Rama First Nation, who were the stewards of the lands in and around Midland, who were the last stewards of the lands in and around Midland. We also recognize the Métis nationhood currently represented in our community by the Georgian Bay Métis Council. We recognize and deeply respect their ongoing historic connection to these lands. These connections need to be clearly and overtly articulated as part of our collective agreement to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our community. This interview is part of MPL's Local Writers Spotlight throughout the month of November. Follow MPL on your preferred social media channel to follow our month-long celebration of local writers and great reads. Which leads me to tonight's guest, local author Barrie Doyle from Tiny Township. Born in Wales, Barrie is a former journalist, public relations consultant, college professor, broadcaster, and freelance writer. He has lived in Virginia, California, Pennsylvania. Where have I heard Pennsylvania in the news lately? as well as Great Britain and Canada, where he now lives in the beautiful blue water shores of Georgian Bay. Please join me in welcoming Barrie. Barrie, thanks for being with us tonight. We're so thrilled that you could be part of our November Spotlight on Local Writers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a delight.
Oh, good. So we'd like to start off with a brief reading from your latest book, Music for the King. Would you mind telling us a little bit about what the book's about and maybe setting up the passage that you're going to be reading?
Okay. I'm interested in people. I mean, obviously, as a journalist, and I love people's stories, good ones and bad ones, and horrible stories, and I just enjoy kind of getting to know who people are and what motivates them, and I've also been interested in history, and 5, 6, a number of years ago, I went to a performance of Messiah by George Frederick Handel. And I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the music, the Hallelujah chorus, and at Christmas time, you sometimes hear "For unto us a child is born," and those pieces of music, and they're kind of familiar. So we went to hear Messiah with the Bach Elgar Choir and the Toronto Symphony at Roy Thompson Hall. And the program notes that they always give you, when you go in, and I was waiting for the performance to begin. I started reading these notes, and there was this 2-3 paragraphs maybe about the difficulties that Handel had to overcome in order to write this magnificent piece of music. And as I read the piece, I thought, my goodness, like here was a celebrity who had been at the top, and now he was at the bottom, and he was about ready to quit. And then he wrote this piece of music, and then went on to great success after that. And I thought, that's a fascinating story, because that's a universal story. It's not just about him. It's a story, maybe an inspiration for all of us. So he started in Germany, and he was successful all over the place. He became a naturalized British citizen. He was sponsored by the king, and everything was going right. And then they had this royal family. And before I go any further, the one thing that I liked about the story was the parallels with our modern society. You know, the like some of the things that was going on there. I was just like, is that a history book or is it maybe newspaper from today? Anyway, the royal family was extremely dysfunctional. The king, who was George II at the time, absolutely hated his son, Frederick, who was the Prince of Wales. And Frederick even more hated his father and his mother. And there's all kinds of stuff that they both did to each other. It was just appalling, really. But Handel was a favorite of the king. And so Frederick, the Prince of Wales, was always trying to tear down and destroy his father's favorite. So you get all that going on, and then you got illness, and poor Handel was almost broke and was looking at debtor's prison, because in those days, if you couldn't pay up your bills, you were in jail, which is kind of silly, because how can you pay your bills if you're in jail? You know, anyway, that was the thinking. So that's that kind of story. And then as I did more research, I found out some other fascinating stuff that was going on. And one of the people that he bumped into in Dublin was Jonathan Swift, who we know as the author of Gulliver's Travels, but was actually the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. And he stood in the way of the concerts, the debut concert. So there are all these fascinating characters and everything. And I just thought, I gotta write this story. I gotta do something. So that's where it is. So what I thought I'd do is to start at the very beginning and start the book. Messiah is broken into three parts. The music is broken into three parts. And I tried to do the same with the book. So it's written in three parts. The first part is set in London, the second part is set in Dublin, and the third part is back in London. So I'm trying to draw some parallels with the Messiah, the piece, and I also kind of had some fun with the old-fashioned novels that they used to have, where they the chapter would kind of give you a hint as to what's coming up in the chapter. You know, chapter 1 in which something, you know. So I'm having fun with that. So I'll start with chapter 1. Might as well start at the beginning, but it kind of sets the level.
Sounds perfect.
Chapter 1, in which Mr. Handel confesses concerns. A glistening black carriage drawn by two matching blacks jerked and bumped over the cobblestones, clattering to a halt in front of the modest red brick townhouse that was so typical of the newly built district of Mayfair. On the carriage door, the coat of arms proudly announced its aristocratic ownership. And inside, a tall, elegantly dressed thin man adjusted his fashionable brown curled wig. He waited patiently as a liveried footman, clad in brilliant white trimmed red coat and breeches, jumped down from the rear of the carriage, crossed the narrow paving stones, and strode up the stone steps. He knocked imperiously. Ignoring the steady cold drizzle that seeped down the back neck of his coat, the footman bowed slightly to the young serving girl who answered. "Milord, his Grace, the Duke of Devonshire, to call upon Mr. Handel," the foreman said. He handed her a calling card. As the door opened wider, William Cavendish, the third Duke of Devonshire, jumped out of the carriage and rushed into the house. Sweeping off his cloak and tricorn hat, he handed both to the girl, along with his gold-tipped walking stick, to the hovering maid. A few candles flickered, fighting against the dreary gloom of the rainy spring afternoon. The Duke cast his eyes critically, noting that for every candle lit, even more remained unused or sat partially burned in their holders. The oil lamps were more unused and unlit, a distinct change for a room that normally blazed with light. Dark maroon curtains had been pulled wide as possible in the front steps. They were held open by ornate yellow wooden ties that contrasted starkly with the white Minutes later, a heavy-set man, sweating profusely, limping in pain, entered the room. His dark, drab, brown outfit was topped by a fashionably coiffed white wig, sitting somewhat askew on his head. Devonshire suppressed a slight smile. Handel had never been overly fastidious about his appearances. If he was dressed and wore a wig, that was good enough. No matter if the clothes were mismatched or the wig ill-fitting, his brilliant mind was too busy composing arias and concertos to worry about sartorial details. Your Grace, my apologies for keeping you waiting, but you surprised me, said George Frederick Handel. I did not expect the pleasure of entertaining you in my modest premises. I remember your kind visit last spring, when it's a delight to see you. Handel bowed formally and gestured the Duke towards a well-appointed, deep green settee. Although he smiled at his guest, Handel's deep-set brown eyes were heavy with worry. Where once they'd sparkled with gusto and enjoyment, they were now lined and drawn, outlined by dark circles. Sleepless nights had robbed him of his pleasure, of life and music. As the Duke sat, Handel hobbled slowly over to the facing chair. Devonshire waved his hand airily to dismiss the apology. I'm given to understand that you've closed your latest opera after only 3 performances. Why? Desdemona was an excellent work, and your music was, as always, sublime. You are too kind, Your Grace. Devonshire flipped his hands up quickly. William, if you please. We're surely past the formalities in our long friendship, at least in private. Handel smiled in agreement. Very well then, William, but not everyone agrees with your generous assessment of my operas these days. Glumly, he added, in fact, very few at all. Most of those who do attend my presentations spend their time catcalling and hooting throughout the performance. I was there when you opened. Yes, the audience was thin and very rowdy, but it was a foul night. I expected the crowds to build over the next several weeks. You advertised well, did you not? I did indeed, Handel said bitterly. Posters and bills handed out and placed across the city, but as fast as they were put up, paid gangs tore them down. Just last week, a mob burst into my printer's establishment, stealing hundreds of bills right off the press and burning them in the alley behind. Of course, they were gone before the watchman showed up. Not that those lazy, drunken excuses for the law could have done anything. Beyond that, my rivals mock me. They say atrocious things. They sabotage my presentations. There are many who wish to see me destroyed and forced to leave England. Handel sighed heavily and slumped in his seat. They want to leave it all to the English. He scowled angrily, then turned as the door opened. Clacking footsteps on the wooden floor preceded the appearance of his butler, brandishing a canter of wine, 2 glasses, and a plate of sweet cakes. Handel remained silent while the butler poured wine and offered cakes to the Duke. Not like you, George, to pass up such a nice glass of wine and cakes, Devonshire sipped, noticing that Handel took nothing for himself. And a good wine it is, too. German, no doubt. Italian, sir, Italian. A brief smile crossed Handel's face, then a wince of pain. My gout. He grunted and pointed to his right foot, which rested delicately on a footstool. Have to stay away from rich food and drink. Damn pain keeps me up at night. He gestured with his left hand. Not to mention the palsy I suffered a few weeks back. It still nags at my right arm from time to time, like an old fishwife. I'm a wreck, Your Grace. A physical and creative wreck. Devonshire knew what a sacrifice it was for Handel to restrain his enthusiasm and his notorious desire for the finest of food and drink. The gout must indeed be bothering him. Stories have flourished about Handel's prodigious appetite. Ever since the days of good Queen Anne, Handel's cheerful willingness to enjoy the hospitality of families, of noble families, and provide entertainment has been matched by his equal willingness to partake of the heavy feasts. Devonshire thought back to one particular lavish and boisterous evening at the Duke of Waverley's house. Handel had been challenged to compose a short piece on the spot in return for a flagon of the finest Italian wine, a brace of pheasants for his own table, and a platter full of sweet, delectable pastries. Grinning, Handel had promptly sat down at the Duke's pianoforte and produced a sparkling number that just delighted his adoring audience. No, Devonshire thought, turning down excellent food and drink was definitely outside the norm for Handel. I just want to skip ahead a bit. Handel, head down, was rubbing his ailing leg, and he didn't notice the Duke's startled reaction to his confession. My audiences don't like my music anymore. I don't understand it. Each time I produce even more magnificent operas and concertos, where they once loved, now they hate. My jealous enemies undermine my very existence in the city, and except for a very few like yourself, even my friends keep their distance. Devonshire opened his mouth to argue the point, but his host was now well and truly pouring out his fears and dashed hopes that he'd been bottling up for months. Handel's German accent, normally softened, grew broader and louder as his pent-up anger and frustrations emptied out. Handel was notorious for his short temper and rages. Once during a rehearsal, he'd been so furious with a featured soprano, he'd literally picked her up and held her out the window of the upper rehearsal hall at Covent Garden Theatre. Only when the diva had agreed to sing the piece the way Handel wanted it, did he relent and bring her back inside. Candles flickered, the fast approaching dusk darkened the room to match Handel's mood. He was building up to another of his legendary furies. He looked down at Devonshire suddenly, punching his fists together. I am nothing more than a pawn in the battle between His Majesty and the Prince of Wales. I am even told by the Prince's lapdogs that I am the embodiment of the old German heritage and European culture, all that the king represents, while the Prince and his entourage are the personification of a new and glorious England. Handel spat the Prince's name, his dark eyes flashing with anger, and glared at Devonshire in defiance. He raised his hand, jabbing the air with his forefinger. I speak no treason, sirrah, but you must surely realize that the Prince and his followers have poisoned people against the king. He has built his own opposition power, whipping up anger and disloyalty under the guise of culture. His newspaper friends rail against my operas, calling them old-fashioned and unworthy of modern England. And they promote their own English operas. They want to show that I am out of touch, that I am a mere stand-in for the king in that battle. And moving ahead again. The pain in his leg grew fiercer. Laudanum, John, bring me my laudanum. Handel shouted at the door, hoping that his butler would hear. I have an inclination to remove myself from this godforsaken city and its intrigues. Perhaps there are other places who would appreciate my most excellent music. Handel struggled to his feet again and shuffled over to a small desk beside the wall. He rummaged through some papers and picked one up, handing it to the Duke. You've seen this? Handel asked. With one glance, Devonshire nodded. In his hand was a reproduction of a caricature of Handel that had been making its way around the hearths of London nobility. Titled The Charming Brute, it showed a bloated Handel complete with a pig's face and snout, seated on a wine barrel at a pipe organ, which was overflowing with fruits, hams, roast fowl, and bottles of wine. My erstwhile friend did this, Handel said listlessly. If my friends mock me thus, you can guess what my opponents do. He shook his hand suddenly, then stared at Devonshire as if seeing his guest for the first time. My manners, sir, your grace, William, I beg your forgiveness for the bleatings of an old man. Devonshire tut-tutted the apology just as the door opened and the butler hustled in with a small bottle and a glass, Handel downed the potent painkiller, and tried to persuade his caller to dine with him. My thanks, George, but no, Devonshire said. I have a previous engagement. But before you decide to leave London, do not waiting. I have an idea that might suffice. In the meantime, I would like to commission a concerto for a garden party at my Chatsworth estate. I'd pay the usual fee, of course. You leave for Ireland then? Handel knew that as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, in effect, the King's Viceroy, the Duke needed to visit Ireland on a regular basis in order to oversee the Irish Parliament and to perform the very tasks required of his King's representative. Devonshire nodded and rose. If you would allow me the indulgence of giving you some advice, my friend. He paused at the door, waiting while the butler hurried out. Make no hasty decisions to return to Germany or Italy. I'm sure these momentary issues will resolve themselves, and the music of the great George Frederick Handel will once again enthrall the people of this city and this land. Despite Handel's initial reluctance to accept the assignment, and his arguments that he didn't want the Duke stained by his personal fall from grace, Devonshire was adamant. He assured Handel that his music was well worth the suggested meager sum. After promising that his man would appear in the morning with a partial payment, Devonshire climbed into his carriage and left. Handel stood by the window unmoving, Groupie's caricature still in hand, and he reacted only as his butler started to light more lamps. Leave them, John, put them all out. I'm retiring upstairs to my bedroom. No more visitors today. He shuffled out of the room, ripped off his wig, handing it to his man, and then slowly and painfully, he climbed the stairs. So he's at the bottom. He's right at the bottom, and just to this book, everything that I write about in here has been researched, and it really happened. I'm just putting some words into mouths, but the situations are there. It really happened. So I followed the story, and he writes this magnificent piece of music called Messiah. And he had some strange characters that he was dealing with at the time. And as I said, he went to Dublin. Devonshire actually invited him to come to Dublin. And Dublin at the time was the second largest city in the United Kingdom. And Dublin was a cultural center just as much as London was. So Devonshire invited him to come over and do a whole series of concerts, what they called a season. So he would come in the fall and provide music right through until the spring for the whole winter season. And he accepted, Handel accepted, and he was asked to do a concert for 3 charitable organizations to raise money. It was a fundraiser. And he thought that he'd been doing the whole season with his favorite music, with the things that people liked, you know, all his latest hits. And he decided that he would try this new piece that he'd worked on, and he wrote it in 24 days. That's the thing that blew me away. He wrote this entire magnificent piece of music in 24 days. And he decided, I'll do that as the performance of this oratorio as the fundraiser. And there's a lot of controversy over it, and we can maybe talk about that later. But I'll just take you through to the concert in Dublin, a much shorter piece, but just to give you a flavor of what happens. And they're in the Music Hall in Dublin. Inside, Matthew Durberg, who was first violin, patiently tuned the orchestra as the choir and the soloists entered and took up their positions. Stage boys scurried about and began turning up the flames on the footlights. The lights themselves drenched the entire theater in the deep red of the velvet curtains that hung over the stage. The gold thread trimmings sparkled in the light. A special box prepared for the Viceroy was draped with the Union flag. The soloists took their place on stage, and MacLean took his seat at the portable organ that had been especially installed in the music hall for this occasion. Handel entered to great applause and seated himself at his harpsichord. At a signal, Handel stood, as did the orchestra, as the Viceroy entered his box. Dubourg conducted as the orchestra played God Save the King. As the final notes died away, Handel bowed deeply towards the Viceroy's box. Silence then descended over the audience as the crowd settled. Handel raised his arms, and the strings began the slow, dramatic notes of the Sinfonia to open the presentation. If there was one thing that subconsciously impressed himself upon Handel as he led, it was the absolute hush that descended on the audience as they worked deeper and deeper into the oratorio. He was so intent on conducting and playing, he couldn't look around and gauge the audience reaction. All he knew was that apart from a few stifled coughs, the prevailing mood was silence. Was it a silence of dislike or disapproval? Or was it a silence of appreciation? He could not tell. So far, there'd been no reaction, positive or negative, to Mrs. Cibber's participation. Let me just pause here. She was involved in a huge sex scandal in London, and she was notorious. She was the victim, but she was notorious anyway. As soon as the performance came to the beginning of part 2, and the air he had written especially for her voice, it was a performance such as Handel had never heard from her before, not even in the rehearsals. He chanced a quick glance at his audience to his right and saw them mesmerized. The orchestra's final notes slowly and quietly ended. Before she could take her seat and the choir stand for the next chorus, a visibly moved Patrick Delaney, tears streaming down his face, suddenly jumped to his feet in the balcony and shouted, "Woman, for this all thy sins be forgiven you." He gripped the balcony rail, and applause quickly broke out around the hall. Susanna, unsure of what to do, flashed a quick and appreciative smile at Handel and took her seat, and the choir and the orchestra began the next piece. The applause died away, and Delaney sat right at the end. She was a pariah in society, and this kind of redeemed her. Patrick Delaney was one of the leading clerics in Dublin at the time, and it really happened. It really happened that way. He shouted in the middle of the performance. So it's a fascinating story of people who come back, and that's what I wanted to do: motivate people. That doesn't matter how low you are, you can make it back.
I think that you did that very well, and I found her one of the most intriguing characters in the book.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed reading her portions, and I think that there's definitely more story there of a character like her.
Yeah, I see her as another one of the, it's what happens today on social media, and a celebrity takes one step wrong and they get lambasted and ridiculed and just go through horrible invasions of privacy and what have you. And she did that. You don't think of it this way, but she went through that in 1743. I mean, it. You know what they say: the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Very true. It's very true, and there are a lot of parallels, as you
Yeah,
mentioned earlier, with modern times and what you write about in the book. There's a heist sort of scene there with the ship and potential smuggling and things like that, and that could have easily been a scene out of the latest gangster sitcom.
exactly. Well, that part was made up.
No, but it's just it fits
Yeah,
so well the two timelines. It was great. You
yeah.
you sort of mentioned where Music for the King came from and where you got the idea from, but was it your research, after having received the pamphlet at the performance, and
Yeah.
was it your research that you delved into afterwards that caused you to sort of sink your teeth really into Handel's life and this portion of of his story?
Yeah, it was the spark that lit the fuse, so to speak, that two or three paragraphs. But I was doing it more just out of innate curiosity. I had no thought of creating a story about it. So yeah, I did a little bit more research, and because I thought, well, is that true? And I read it, and did a bit more research, and wow, yeah, it is true. And then I started thinking, well, I've not heard this story before. Um, I bet a lot of people haven't. And so that's what got me really into it then. And then as I started getting more into it, I started thinking, I was just going to write an article. But more I got into it, the more I thought, oh, this has got the hallmark of a great novel. And so that's when I started really getting into it. And I went to Dublin because I wanted to walk around Dublin. I didn't realize how close there are two cathedrals there, and the choirs from both cathedrals were used in the performance. I didn't realize how close they were. It was only a matter of 4 or 5 blocks, and then you left the one church and you went down this kind of a winding street called Fishamble Street, and this new music hall was built right there, and is right at the River Liffey, and so it was important for me to get the feel for the area, and it was it was a cold, miserable day when I was wandering around. No rain, thank heaven, but it was an interesting day. So that's part of what I do. I try to go to the places that I'm writing about.
Right. I was just going to ask, your earlier works with the overthrow of conspiracies, they have a historical element to them as well. So how did the research for Music for the King differ for what you may have done for those books?
In the other books, I've been dealing more with legends and saying, well, what if there was some truth in the legends? What if not only were the legends true, but what if they were still viable today? And how would people handle the one that comes to mind immediately is the in the second book, the Lucifer Scroll, the what's sometimes called the Spear of Destiny, or the Holy Lance. And I took that legend, but behind the legend was this deep set belief by a lot of military leaders that the lance was real, and if they had it, the legend said that the one who held the lance in his possession would control the world. And so you had Charlemagne, you had Napoleon Bonaparte, you had Adolf Hitler, all wanting it. And so I thought, well, if that was true, if the legend was true, look at the impact it had on history, and what would it do today? So that's what I was doing there. But this book, so I was sort of doing ancient legend, but also modern day. This book, Music for the King, is strictly historical. It covers a 2-year period from 1741 to 1743. And so it was a real change for me as a writer. But I was more interested in the personalities and the characters and the parallels with, as I said earlier, the parallels with modern society.
The writing process is different for every writer. Can you tell us a bit about your process? Do you outline everything, or do you write what you feel? Do you set aside specific times of day or specific goals?
I'm going to go back to something that I when I was a reporter, I interviewed an author about a book a novelist who'd written a book, and for the life of me, I can't remember who it was, and so therefore it couldn't have been a very good book, or at least not. It was a book that didn't make an impact on me. But I interviewed the author, and the author said, I asked exactly the same question: do you outline, or like, where's the story go? And he said to me, no, he said, I let the characters tell the story. I just go with the flow. What would they do? Well, they tell me what they're going to do. And I mean, I'm a journalist, right? Hard-nosed journalist. I was working for the Star at the time, the Toronto Star. And I went back to the newsroom and I was thinking, yeah, right. What a lot of codswallop. And then I read about J.K. Rowling, for example. She outlines to the nth degree. She spends so much. She knows what everybody's doing, and she's got charts. And the first guy was right. That's the way I do it. I create the characters and literally, like, yeah, I wonder what they would do in this situation. I wonder how they'd react, and I let them tell the story. I mean, it sounds stupid, but it works for me. I remember one time I was working on a situation, and I think it was might have been the first book or the second book, I forget which. And I came out, and I was thinking, I just don't know what to do. And my wife said to me, you look awfully depressed. And I said, well, I've written them into such a box. I don't know how they're going to get out of it. And she said, well, just think about it overnight, and don't worry about it. It'll happen. And I woke up the next morning. And I thought, oh yeah, I know what they could do. Stone would do this, and I had my answer. So I let the character tell the story. This one, Music for the King, is different. The plot is already there. I know the beginning, I know the end, and I know everything that happens in the meantime. Even the characters I know are real. And so I have to be faithful to that storyline. So that was a little different for me. As for when I write, I'm a kind of haphazard guy. I'll write in a fury for a few days, and then, especially this summer, it was so beautiful, right? So yeah, we got the beach there, and it's a beautiful day. And I could stay up here and write, or I could go to the beach. I'll go to the beach. So, I just sort of, now, I'm not writing, but my mind is working.
Yeah.
So it helps me when I come back. I have really plotted and I've really worked it out, but I don't have a set time. Sometimes I work in the morning and sometimes late at night, whenever the mood hits.
Well, that's fair. How long does it take you to write a novel?
the three boys, about a year and a bit. You know, from the time I first enter the first words to the time I sign off on the final draft, and it's been edited and all that kind of stuff. About a year and a bit. Music for the King took longer, partly because I was writing the other books and I was sort of doing it in between. And I originally, when I started with my first book, I was going to write one book. They say everybody has one book in them. And I had my one book, and I wrote the Excalibur Parchment, and I was like, I'm working on it, and everything's fine. And the publisher said to me, you know, what do you think about doing a trilogy with these characters? Because people who like the story will want to read another story. And people who come in on the second book will say, wow, even though it's standalone, I want to read the first. And then if you do a third, then people come in on the third, you know. And I thought, oh, crap. You know, I only wanted to do one. Now they want me to do three. So after I finished the second book, I really, okay, now I'm gonna write this Handel story. I need to get my mind cleansed of all these other characters, and just sort of, you know, and I couldn't, so I had to write the third. And I no sooner finished writing the third, Prince Madoc's Secret. And I've had so many people writing to me and say, so what happened? You can't leave the story there. We got to know what's going on. And, you know, when's the fourth one coming out? And I'm thinking, well, but it's a trilogy. Is there such a thing as a quadrilogy? You know, I don't know. So I really did put it aside then, and I said, no, I'm gonna finish the Handel book, and that's what I've done. So this summer I'm back, and I'm working on the fourth book in the series, tentatively called The Dragon's Legacy. So I'm working on the fourth one, and I keep thinking, okay, is that going to be enough? Can I go for some other characters and some other situations? I don't know. I'll see what happens. But that's the way it goes, I guess.
It's true. It sounds like it's a bit of that Stephen King misery thing, you know?
Yeah, exactly. You know, even my namesake, Arthur Conan Doyle, he got so sick and tired of writing about Sherlock Holmes, and he killed him off. And they still wanted more stories, whereas they had to bring him back to life, you know. So
can you speak about your journey as a local author? You know, where did the idea to bring your one book out come from, and how did you get started?
Well, as I said, everybody has that one book in them, I think. A lot of people don't push it and don't do it, but everybody. We have a friend that has written her memoir, and it's. I honestly wouldn't say it was publishable, but it's a fascinating story. It's an incredible story, and so I was in that boat, and I thought, okay, well, I got one story to tell, and then the writing magazines and what have you always tell you, you know, start with something that you know and something that you love, and write about that. And I had always, as you pointed out, I was born in Wales, and the Welsh legends have always intrigued me, and I was especially taken. When I was a kid in Wales, living in Wales, everybody knew the stories of King Arthur and Excalibur, and so I had that floating around in my head, and I thought, you know, can I come up with a new twist on the Arthurian legends? And that's what I did, trying to take it from the time of Arthur and bring it forward into the modern day. And what if Excalibur was real? What if it had powers, supernatural powers that other people wanted, and, you know, to the detriment of society? So that's how I got started. And I as I said, I thought I'd just write the book, get it out of my system. because as a journalist and then in public relations, and then when I was teaching at Humber College in the School of Media Studies, all the time I realized I was writing about other people's stories. I was telling other people's stories or teaching my students how to tell other people's stories. I thought, it's time I do my own. And so that's how I got started.
And so how did you have it? How did you get it published? Did you submit it to a bunch of publishers or?
Yeah, it's I had an agent in the United States, and it took me from the time I started writing, and I have to say that for me, writing that book was a stress reliever and a pressure thing. My grandson was born with a congenital heart defect, and his first 3 years of life, he had 4 open heart surgeries. He suffered a stroke, and he was not expected to live. And I remember I started writing the book to almost as a release valve for the pressure. And there was one day when he was under the operation. He went in at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was supposed to be a 5-hour operation, and 9 hours later, we still hadn't heard a word. And he'd been given a less than 50-50 chance anyway. And I was writing just to get my mind off it. So for me, it was cathartic in that sense. That's why I started the writing. And I had a good enough reception from the agent. But the problem with the American publishers is that I'm not American, and I am not well known. And they were going through a phase where they wanted only well-known Americans. They wanted names on their books because it was all about return on investment, I guess. So I found this small Canadian publisher up in Winnipeg called Word Alive Press, and I contacted them, and they were interested, and so we took it from there. So it took about 2 or 3 years to go through that process, and I gave up on the American publishers. If they're not interested in me, I'm not interested in them. So, and the ironic thing is, I have a huge readership in the United States, and there's all kinds of Americans that write to me and want to know what's going on with the next books, and they're buying the latest book, and so I'm building it's very difficult as an author because no publisher, not even the Random Houses and all, they don't really support authors anymore unless they're really, really well known. Otherwise, you're the one that has to do all the promotion and what have you. And they told me that if I don't have a platform of at least 18,000 followers on my social media or on my books, they're not even interested. Well, it's hard to do that. So yeah, I've got a good readership in the States, but I say it's probably 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people rather than 18. So fine. I've got a publisher. They like my work, and I'm doing, except for COVID. This book came out right at the start of COVID. Like, it was within it was just before Easter. And book launch, forget it. Book signings, forget it. Book promotions, forget it. I've done a couple of Zoom meetings with book clubs and obviously with the library. But other than that, there's no opportunity to get out and tell the story. So, we keep plugging away on social media and doing stuff like this. It's a hard slog this year.
For sure.
Everybody's feeling the same.
It's a difficult.
Yeah, musicians, artists, they're all going through the same thing. I have there's a woman by the name of Catherine White who is with the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and she wrote this. She said that I captured the timelessness of Messiah and helps the reader to live the drama that birthed one of the most celebrated pieces of our time, Catherine White. And she was telling me, I wrote and thanked her for that comment. And she told me the Metropolitan Opera is shut down until at least the middle of next year. So all the singers, all the musicians, all the backstage people, everybody out of work. So, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm whining. I'm not. We're all going through it.
For sure.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for local authors, people who are looking to get their one book that's in them published?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, you know, read. I think that's the most important thing for a writer, is to read, and to read all kinds of things, not just the little narrow things that you enjoy reading. I'm appalled at the number of people I meet from time to time that say, "Oh, I don't like reading at all." That's like saying, "I don't like breathing. I don't like eating," and it just doesn't make sense. But I also run into people, "Oh, I never read fiction. I just read nonfiction." And my challenge to prospective writers, you know what? Why don't you try it? Read outside the genres that you enjoy. Not necessarily certainly for knowledge, but not necessarily solely for knowledge. How about learning how to write? How about turns of phrases and getting a sense of style and getting a sense of what makes a book good for you? What do you like? You know, and then read it. And then especially, if you want to write historical fiction, you want to write science fiction, fantasy, you want to do that, read Tolkien. That'll help you. You want to write romance, it doesn't matter. Mysteries, read extensively. What do you like about those things? What do you not like? And once you do that, with a view in your mind, with your mindset that, you know, I'm gonna write a book. I'm gonna write a story. I've got the germ of a story. Write about what you know, places you know. You know what I would love to see right up here? I would like to see some local writer, especially somebody from the First Nations, to write some of the fantastic stories that they have. To do what I did, write about the legends. Say, what if? Write about the history. Write about the problems that they have, that their young people are, it doesn't matter what. I'd love to see those stories being written. And the people that live here in Midland and Tiny and Tay and the whole area, man, they've got a whole gold mine of stories. And they could do it. And there'd be all kinds of people wanting to read it. So I would say, write about the stuff you know and read. And when you finish reading, read some more. And then you can sit down at and I warn you, if you are a local writer, I warn you right now, you're going to go through and you're going to write some stuff. And when you're finished, you're going to say, well, that wasn't very good. That was crap. And then start again and edit and redo. That day that I was waiting for news about our grandson, I was writing. It was the only thing I could do to keep myself sane through that whole day. 2 days later, I went back to the stuff I'd written. It was crap. It was awful. It was just went right into the round file and started again. But it's what you go through as a writer.
And so, on the heels of your advice, what is it that you're reading these days?
Well, I did something that I always do. I just finished it. Every year, I try to read alternate years, I do read Tolkien, and this year was my year for Lord of the Rings, and I read all three books: The Fellowship, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. I read all three. Next year I'll be doing The Hobbit. You know, I read. I have a very, very good friend, Elizabeth Duncan, who writes mysteries, and the Penny Brannigan mysteries, and I read her. I just found a wonderful series, which I know you've got in the library because my wife got them out, and the Mitchell and Markaby. Anyway, they're crime mysteries set in the Cotswolds in England. And let's see, what else am I reading? I'm just sort of been pushing my way through some. I do, apart from all of this other stuff, I do a lot of crisis management and training and workshops for organizations that need help dealing with the media in times of crisis. And I've been obviously with COVID, that's one thing. Been a lot of those this year, but I've been doing a lot of work, and I'm writing a textbook, and I just finished doing a television, a video online course for that. So I've been working on that too. So I haven't been doing as much reading as I would like.
Well, it sounds like you're reading quite extensively on a variety of different topics. So that sounds like you're following your own advice.
My problem is, yeah, my problem is I'm one of those book people that I have a stack of books that I've read like that, and I got a stack of books that I want to read like that, and then there's a stack of books that I bought. Yeah, yeah. So I've got books to take me through a couple of years without buying another one, which will never happen because I'm always buying.
You are in good company there, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, people love books.
True. It's very true. Well, Barrie, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us tonight. We are grateful to be able to discuss Music for the King and look forward to your next book. And you heard it here, folks, the 4th installment of the Oak Grove Conspiracies. That's exciting.
That's right. Yeah.
So for
and you know, hey, whatever happens, but I may go back into historical fiction too. You never know.
Well, you never know. That's good to hear. You can find copies of Music for the King and Barrie's Oak Grove Conspiracies at the Midland Public Library. And if you'd like to own a copy of any of Barrie's books, and the holidays are fast approaching and books make great gifts, you can purchase a copy from our friends at Georgian Bay Books here in Midland, or by visiting Barrie's website, barriedoyle.com. Thank you to you, our audience, for joining us this evening. You can visit our website for a full list of MPL's upcoming programs and events, including our next virtual authors event on Thursday, December the 3rd, with author Kate Hilton. Thank you, everyone, for attending. It was such a pleasure, and it was great getting to chat with you and celebrating a local writer. And I wish all of you a great evening.